Hi, I'm William Spaniel. Let's learn about international relations. Today's topic is understanding war, and the big question is, well, how do we understand war? We spent the last few lectures developing a solid foundation of the bargaining model of war, and now that you have that, it's going to be easier to see why you need it to be able to explain war, to predict war, and to understand war. To recap, the bargaining model of war tells us that for war to occur between unitary actor states, one of the following things must exist. You need to have incomplete information and incentives to misrepresent, or you need to have shifting power, which leads to preventive war and preemptive war, or you need to have issue indivisibility, although I note here that we don't really like that explanation because you can always come up with some sort of side payment to resolve the indivisibility problem. Or I'm not going to discount the fact that there might be some other mechanism that causes bargaining failure that we've yet to fully identify. But at least for now, where we are in international relations, in the scholarly pursuit of international relations, we only have those top three mechanisms, and of those top three mechanisms, we only think that the top two, incomplete information and incentives to misrepresent, as well as shifting power, are actually helping us explain why wars occur. Now, just to be very explicit about what this slide is saying, is you need to have one of these mechanisms in order for war to occur. If you do not have one of these mechanisms, then you do not get war occurring in any interaction between two unitary actor states. And that might seem trivial and might seem unimportant, but hold on for 1 second. Let's think about why wars occur. If you go into a history textbook, for example, open up the chapter on the American Revolution. What caused the American Revolution to occur? Well, the textbook answer you commonly get is taxation without representation. Brits were taxing American colonies, and American colonials did not have, at least they felt, adequate representation to justify that taxation. If you look at the common textbook example or textbook explanation for the American Civil War, you'll see that it was slavery that caused the American Civil War. It was this rivalry between the North and the South over the slavery and the fate of slavery in the United States, which caused the American Civil War to occur. And if you look at the textbook explanation, one of the textbook explanations at least, of World War I, it was colonial ambitions. Countries that were late to the colonial game wanted to make up for this. They wanted to gain their own colonies, and the way that they sought to do this was to fight a war against current colonial powers. Now, just to be clear, there are a bunch of different explanations for these wars on your screen and a bunch of different explanations for other wars that are not on your screen, but the common textbook explanations that you get from historians is overlooking one critical factor. Why not bargain? None of those explanations that I just gave you are sufficient for war. And that's because they do not explain why the parties could not reach a mutually preferable bargain. War is costly after all, and those costs incentivize the parties to reach a mutually preferable deal that leaves both parties better off than if they had fought a war. And in fact, it's these costs of war that explain why peace prevailed up until the wars began. States don't just immediately jump into fighting. They try to negotiate solutions, and they try to work through their problems without reaching wars because these wars are so darn costly. But because you're not explaining why bargaining failed here, you're not actually explaining fully why the war occurred. You do not have a sufficient explanation for war, a sufficient cause for war. So overall, the recipe for war is twofold. You need two things for war to occur. You need grievance, which is the thing that textbooks normally focus on, like taxation without representation, slavery, territorial ambitions, and so forth. And you also need a bargaining problem, the things that we've been focusing on in this unit, like incomplete information and shifting power. With only one of these things, you do not get conflict. Wars do not occur with only one of these things. If you have grievances between two parties, you should be expecting them to negotiate a solution. If you have some sort of bargaining problem between two parties, like incomplete information and shifting power, but no grievance, then you have no reason for them to fight. It's the interaction of these two things. These two things are jointly sufficient for war, where having a grievance, having a reason to be upset at someone else, and also having something that interferes with bargaining, that is what causes wars to occur. Without both of these things, with only one of these things, you do not get war. You need to have both of these things around in order for you to get war to occur. And as a result, your high school history classes were really lacking here because they were always focusing on the grievance part and they were never focusing on the bargaining problem. All right, so where does that take us? Why do we care about these bargaining problems so much? Well, Our research tends to focus on bargaining problems and not grievances, and that's not without good reason or without good justification. The reason that we focus on these bargaining problems and we tend not to focus on the grievances so much is that, as far as we know, there are only two types of bargaining problems, the shifting power and the incomplete information stories, and, not really that issue indivisibility, and, maybe there's something else out there, maybe not, but for now, we just have two different sources of bargaining problem to address. In contrast, there are way too many types of grievances to count. If you look at any explanation for any war and then cross-reference it with another grievance explanation for war, a different war, you're going to be getting, on average, very disparate things. It's not very common for the same grievance to cause a war in one place and then cause a war in another place. So the types of grievances that you can be looking at is a very, very long list. In contrast, the types of bargaining problems that cause war, again, as far as we know, really only two of them. And so if we're interested in understanding why wars occur and trying to stop wars from happening in the future, we need to be looking at things that recur over time. And the things that recur over time are these bargaining problems precisely because there are only two of them. And moreover, it's much easier to convince parties to negotiate solutions, to figure out ways of resolving these sorts of bargaining problems, how to have them transmit information to one another to resolve incomplete information, or how to halt the progress of shifting power to avoid those bargaining problems and sparking war. It's much more difficult, in contrast, to convince two sides that have been long aggravated with one another to sit down and sing kumbaya with one another. It's much easier to convince parties to bargain than it is to have them just lay down all of their burdens and stop having any grievances with one another. And that's why we tend to focus on these sorts of bargaining problems. So that's understanding war for you. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.